Hello, I have a question for us today. Have you ever wondered why Jesus came to earth as a Jewish baby boy under Roman rule? Have you ever wondered that? Today's message is entitled The Kingdom for the Outsider. And the message or the passage of scripture we're going to read from the day is Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 21, where it says the following. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Verse 20, and he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." As we think about Jesus and even the circumstances he was born, we know that he was in a manger because there was no room in the inn. Joseph and Mary had gone back for a census and all the places were taken, so he had to be in the barn with farm animals, and that's where Jesus lays. We see that he was born into a poor family. If we understand the story of Jesus, we also know that at some point Joseph and Mary and Jesus had to flee because Herod, who was ruler over that particular province, wanted him dead. So Joseph and Mary had to be awakened in a dream. I think Joseph was awakened in a dream, and they had to go to Egypt. So, in essence, Jesus was an immigrant child in Egypt. Another way we can look at it is we look at the circumstances of Jesus' birth and his years. From the very beginning, Jesus understood what it meant to be an outsider, someone who was not in privilege. And so, as we look at that scripture, we see that he had opened the scroll, announced good news for the poor, freedom for the captives, sight for the blind, liberation for the oppressed, and then the year of the Lord's favor. And so, if we understand that, we see that Jesus' mission statement often begins with dealing with those who are outsiders or marginalized. When we look at this passage, we can ask the question, who are the outsiders named? First of all, the poor were named. Now, when we talk about the poor in this passage, we're not just talking about financial poverty, those who lacked wealth, although that was a part of it. In Jewish thought, the poor, I think it's toshi in Greek, also meant those who were without power, status, or protection. So you weren't just talking about the economically poor, but also those who were socially marginalized, widows who were socially marginalized in that society, orphans who were socially marginalized, foreigners, day laborers. There were lots of people who were considered poor. They were voiceless. They lacked wealth. They lacked status in that society. So Jesus, of course, was talking about the poor, understanding in the Greco-Roman system that wealth and status meant everything. And if you did not have that, you were considered poor and voiceless. Now, spiritually, we also understand the poor were also those who recognized dependence on God. So, in essence, we can say that Jesus announced favor to those who had been overlooked, trampled on, and left behind by society, both materially and socially. And those who are left in those circumstances often have to depend on God because they can depend on nobody else. So one of the outsiders' names is the poor. Other outsiders, captives, people who were bound physically, prisoners, or spiritually and emotionally, those who are dealing with fear, with trauma, with addiction, so many different things. As we look in that time, we can think about those who were imprisoned for debt. That was a common thing in the society then. If you owed money and you couldn't pay, then you were sent to prison. That's part of the parable, the unforgiving servant. There was a debt that that servant couldn't repay, and of course, he was forgiven by the king. That same servant then, of course, goes to somebody who owed him a lot less money, would not forgive them, and sent them to debtor's prison. And of course, the king finds out about that, and then that servant has to deal with going back to debt, going back to prison. So that's just to say that those debt was literally a cause for going in prison during those times. Now, we can also talk about the Jewish people, Israel itself. They were captive under Roman occupation. In other words, Rome ruled, Rome dictated how they lived, Rome gave them their freedoms, and Rome decided when they weren't going to be free. And then also spiritually, those bound by sin, systems of oppression, demonic oppression, so on and so forth. And so captives were those who were dealing with those things. So then there's the blind. Another set of outsiders is the blind. Those who are physically without sight or spiritually unable to see hope. In Jewish prophetic tradition, blindness meant spiritual ignorance, lack of understanding, or in some cases, a willful refusal to see the truth. So when Jesus is talking about healing the blind, he's not just talking about those who didn't have sight physically, although he did some miracles to heal those who couldn't see, but he's talking about opening our spiritual eyes, having a spiritual awakening, having compassion for people so we can actually see God's kingdom, having spiritual awakeness. And then another outsider, the oppressed, those who were crushed by unjust systems, those who were crushed by violence, those who were crushed by abuse, those who were crushed by unjust power, whether it could be Rome's taxation, whether it could be religious leaders placing undue burdens on people, because that's what often happened. Household structures that left many powerless. I believe the Greek word is thrao, which means shattered, broken, and bruised. Think of people who have been broken down by life, by injustice, and by trauma. Jesus is actually promising liberation, the lifting of a crushing weight. And so those were some of the outsiders named in that passage. And then, of course, at the end, Jesus promises to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, that refers to Jubilee, which was every 50 years when the land returned to its original families, debts were canceled, slaves freed. We like to say that's in Leviticus 25. We like to say that's a reset button. So what Jesus was saying is when the kingdom comes, we're going to have a reset button. It means God's radical mercy and justice. Jesus is saying that time is now in freedom for those who are poor, those who are captive, those who are blind, and those who are oppressed. James Cone talks about this. He says, God is the God of the oppressed, and the liberation of the oppressed is at the heart of the divine character. Another way of looking at it then is if we want to see where God is moving, and also where God may call us to move as people. Look amongst those who are hurting, marginalized, oppressed, and suffering. Jesus' words in Luke chapter 4 confirm this. So, as we get ready to close, let's remember the culture centers on insiders, wealthy, powerful, connected. Kingdom centers on outsiders, those who are on the margins. And Jesus, of course, flips the script from our eyes, I like to say, to God's eyes. So as we think about outsiders today, who are the outsiders? Immigrants and refugees, incarcerated, those who are dealing with spiritual and emotional trauma, people in poverty, those marginalized by race, disability, or some other status, and people who have been wounded. And I'll say this sometimes, people who've been excluded by the church or fellowshipping in the faith community. Those are some of the outsiders today. So as we reflect, if Jesus began his mission with outsiders, then following him means that we care for outsiders too. So here's a reflection for us today. Who are the outsiders in my world today? And how am I called to bring the good news of the kingdom? This is William Hemphill thanking you for joining me today. Please remember to love God, love people, and love yourself. Take care and have a wonderful week.